Hi everyone, my name is Paula and welcome to SewSpark Studio. All the templates that I'm going to use will be available on my website, sewsparkstudio.com. So that if you want to make your own baby dragon quilt, you'll be able to find information there about amounts of fabric and that kind of thing, as well as the actual template for the dragon that I'm going to be using. In part one of the baby dragon quilt, we cut the fabrics, we prepared the cloud and sky background, we traced the dragon parts on fusing web, and fused them to fabrics. We assembled the dragon and fused it to the background. We finished by marking guidelines for doing applique stitching. In this video, we will continue on by doing the satin stitching on the dragon. We will add the borders and the backing, do the quilt stitching, and finish with binding the quilt. I'm at the sewing machine and I've got a zigzag set, this number 8 zigzag, and then my settings over here. Right now I have my width on 3. Depending on the size of the pieces that I'm doing the stitching around, I will be changing that. So sometimes I'll use 2, I might even go to 1.5 for some of the smaller pieces like the little white dots in the eye area. But I will always have my length on 0.5 and I will never go wider than 3 on this particular item. But my presser foot is my applique foot, which has the open toe, but you can use a regular sewing foot for applique. I happen to have this one, and my needle is a universal needle size 80-12 is what I'm using today. It doesn't really matter where you start on the image as far as doing the satin stitching, but I usually try and start with pieces that are underneath other pieces. So for example, I'll go through the edges of this piece on the tail before I'll do these pieces here. And probably I'll do this piece and then I'll come down and work on the body before I do these, because these pieces overlap this piece here. Now if I forget, because sometimes I do, and I end up doing an overlapping piece before I do an underlapping piece, with the satin stitch I can do that and probably nobody would know the difference. So it's not the most important thing when you're deciding the order to do your stitching, but it is something that I do think about and try and do with most of the design. So I'm going to start with this piece here. I like to start with the needle down, so I'm just lowering the needle, and I'm going to be stitching on the edge of this fabric. When the needle goes to the right, it's going to be right on the edge of the fabric and the underneath fabric, and then when it goes to the left, it'll be inside the piece. And so foot down, and then I'm going to start by locking the stitches. And on my machine I have this button here with the dot, and if I push that, it is going to do a locking stitch, so it's less visible on the applique. Now on curves, depending on how experienced you are, some curves like this you might be able to navigate by manipulating your fabric. If you're having trouble with that, you can put your needle down, and my machine has a button that I can do that with, and pivot. And this is an outward curve, so I'm going to have the needle on the right, lift the foot, turn slightly, and then take a few more stitches. And always stopping on the right side when you're doing an outward curve. Now as we come around, this is an inward curve, so needle's going to be on the left side. And a little pivot. Same thing again, needle on the left. Now down at the point here, I'm going to stop on the right, lift my foot, and I'm actually going to change my stitch length to 2. It will help me do a little bit neater looking point on this. And then I'm going to stitch pretty much up to where there's no more of that fabric. I'm going to do a turn, and I'm going to do maybe 2 or 3 stitches across the bottom. Actually it's going to be 4. And then I'm going to pivot again, come back up a few stitches, stop on the right, and then I'm going to go back to my 3, and then I'll continue stitching. And when I get to the end, again, I'm going to press that locking button and lock my stitches. So that's the first piece there. So now I'm going to go down, and I'm actually going to do some stitching at the bottom here around the feet, because that's underneath the body. So I'm going to do the toes, but I'm not going to make you watch me stitch every bit of stitching on this part. I'm going to show you a portion of this that I'm going to finesse a little bit. Now, quite often I just do what you might call a more rustic approach. This is where the ends of the legs are going into the body here. And I'd leave my stitch length on 3 and just zigzag right from that point and down and around the rest of it. But if you want to finesse it, you can play with your stitch width. I'm going to do that on this one just to do something different. And so I'm going to start out on 1.5 at the end here. And I like to start with my needle down. So I've done, I don't know, 6 stitches there. Needle is down on the left. I'm going to switch to 2. And now I'm going to take a few more stitches. We'll stop on the left again. Now I'm going to go up to 2.5. And then I'm going to go to the 3. And then I'm going to do the same as I go in here. So I'm at 3. And I'm almost immediately going to go to 2.5. because this one is just quite a short little distance here. And to 2, and to 1.5, and lock it. So you get gradually smaller at the beginning and at the end of the piece. And I'll do the same for the other leg elements. So the satin stitching is all finished. It gives a lot more definition to the overall design. This is why I sometimes choose to use the black when I'm doing the stitching, because everything really pops. And on the back, because I use the stitch cutter on my machine, you can see these little threads, but those are going to be inside the quilt. Nobody's going to see them, so I'm not going to trim those off. I'm going to give this a good press, and then we're ready to start putting on the border pieces. And the inside border is black. This is a 1.5 inch strip. The finished border will be 1 inch wide. And so I'm going to sew a strip on the top and the bottom. I like to pin these just to make sure that they line up properly and that everything is cut to measure properly. So right angles to the fabric, easier to take them out as you sew. And on something like this, I just do one at each end and one in the middle. And then same with the top. I'm at the machine ready to sew the border strips. So I'm back on a straight stitch. Length is 2.5. and I've got my 1/4 inch foot back on the machine because that's the seam allowance for these. So starting at one end, and I'm not going to back stitch these because I'm going to be stitching over top of them. That's something we often do in quilting. First, pressing this the way it was sewn to set the stitching, flatten them. And then I just push the border up, and the seam is towards the border underneath there. And just push it away so that it's nice and flat along the seam line. And now I'm going to press this whole applique, flatten the stitching on that, and the background's gotten a little wrinkled while I was working with the applique. And then I'll pin and sew the rest of this border, and I'll be repeating the same with the middle border that is red and an outer border that is gold. When I cut the borders, I cut the strips for the gold border, but I didn't actually cut the length because I wanted to see it on the quilt before I decided where I wanted the ombre to be positioned. And what I've decided to do is I'm going to center the lighter part and have it go lighter to darker on each of the pieces. And so I'm just going to fold it in half and cut off an equal amount on the end. And that's the last of the borders for our quilt. I've got my quilt on top of the backing right now. This is the right side of the backing, and the wrong side is towards the quilt, although I have another layer to put in the middle. But right now I just want to trim my backing. So I've got a little bit of an edge all the way around. Generally, the bigger the quilt is, the more of an edge I like there. So anywhere from 1 to 2 inches, 2.5 to 5 centimeters is enough for most quilts. If I was going to do like a queen size quilt, I might do 3 inches or a little bit bigger. The idea is when you're quilting, sometimes the fabrics move a little bit, and so you want to have an extra bit there just in case the quilt stretches out there. I do find with smaller ones it's not a big issue though, so less is okay. And then I'm just going to take this and move it up, and I've got some extra fabric here at the bottom, and so what I'm going to do is trim this. And it doesn't have to be a perfect cut. So I'm not cutting this on a rotary mat because this extra edge here is going to get trimmed off later. So again, I'm just going to leave about 2.5, 3 centimeters, 1 inch, 1.5 inches all the way around. And now I'm going to take off the top of the quilt, and I'm going to cut a piece of quilt batting that is the same size as the backing for the quilt. I laid my quilt bat out on the table, and then I put my backing, and this is the right side of the backing, on the quilt bat. And then I trimmed my batting to the same size as my quilt bat. So it also is slightly bigger than the quilt all the way around, and the excess will be trimmed off when it's done. And try and make sure it's as flat as possible, both the batting and the backing at this step. And then I'm going to carefully flip this over because the top of the quilt is going to go on top of this. So I'm going to smooth this out and I'm going to start pinning it. I start pinning in the middle and then I work my way out, smoothing it out once more as I go. So I'm going to start, as I said, in the center, or roughly in the center, and work my way out. I finished safety pinning the quilt sandwich together, so the entire thing is done, including the border. And then I'm going to flip it and just take a look at the back. And what I'm looking for is, are there bubbles that look like when I sew they're going to fold over and become tucks? And the back actually is looking good on this one, so the pinning went well and I don't have to redo anything. I'm now ready to do the quilt stitching. I'm thinking about how I'm going to do the quilt stitching for this quilt, and for parts of it I'm going to draw some lines to follow with my friction pen, which just steams away when I'm done. I already know that I'm going to be outlining the dragon, and I probably will stitch some of the internal details on the dragon as well. And so that's the first thing that I will be working on. Then we have a cloud that the dragon is sitting on. And because this is an Asian dragon, I'm going to try and make these clouds look like Asian clouds. And if you've ever Googled Asian clouds, basically they just have more kind of curlicues in them. And so I'm going to be stitching these curlicues into this cloud. And in the outer border, I'm going to do some Asian clouds. So I'm going to sketch those because I'm not sure I can re-stitch them. I'm going to duplicate some of the Asian cloud that I did on the border for behind the dragon. I'm setting up to start the quilting this morning, and I debated about thread for a bit. Nylon's a possibility, but nylon doesn't lock very well, I find, and it starts pulling out, and this is a baby quilt. You'll probably get washed a lot, and so I've decided I'm just going to go with a kind of cream color, light beige thread, both top and bottom. First, I'm going to change my foot. I always use a walking foot when I'm quilting because it feeds more evenly on both the top and the bottom. So I have to take off the shank and the presser foot that are there and put this one on. And my machine has a built-in walking foot, but I've had a machines and used the separate attachment as well, and it works just as well as this one does. It's just kind of handy having it built in. And I have on a straight stitch, and my stitch length I'm going to put on 3. I like a bit longer stitch when there's more thickness in the fabric. There's going to be some starting and stopping as I do this. I am going to quilt around some of the interior lines, not just the exterior. Change of plans. I'm not liking the cream color along the edge of the black like that. So I am going to do the dragon with black thread. I finished quilting the dragon, so I'm going to do the clouds next, and I'm going to use a cream colored thread similar to the cloud color. I've decided I would prefer to keep black for my bobbin thread. I'm working on the borders now. I'm going to do this first one in the cream color because the stitching is on the background, which is light, and then I'll be switching to black and red. And so this is just straight stitching, pretty straightforward. I've switched to black for the next border right along here. Red thread for the outside edge of the red border. Now I'm using gold colored thread to sew the Asian cloud designs that I drew in the outside border. The Asian clouds are finished, and there's one more step I like to do before I prepare my quilt for binding. I like to do a row of stitching that connects all the layers of my sandwich together. To do that, I'm going to use this 3-step zigzag, number 9 on my machine, and that comes on with a width on 5 and a length on 1. And I'm going to change the length to 2. And that's the stitch I'm going to use. And I'm keeping the walking foot on the sewing machine. And then I'm just going to basically zigzag these together. And I'm keeping the outside edge of the open area of the foot on the outside edge of the top quilt layer here. And I've switched out to cream thread because my gold thread's getting a little low and I don't have more of this color and I need it to finish the binding. This stitching's not going to show in the finished quilt, so it's fine if it's a little different color. The quilt stitching is all completed. I've sandwiched my edges together with the 3-step zigzag. So to just finish off this particular step, I'm going to be doing 3 things. I'm first going to start by trimming off this extra edge here. And I just do this with shears usually. You could do it with your rotary cutter. In particular, if you thought your edges were crooked, it's a good idea to use the rotary cutter. I usually find that just trimming with the shears is adequate for this. So all around on all 4 sides, you want to trim off the extra fabric there. And I'm going to remove my safety pins, the ones that are still left in here, and I've got a lot of thread trimming to do. The quilt is ready for binding, but before I do that, I'm just going to take a moment and steam out the markings that I made for when I was doing my quilting. And so all that takes is a hot iron with some steam. 4 strips that I cut for binding. So I'm going to sew those together right now. I've got the standard shank on, and I'm using the 1/4 inch foot to sew a 1/4 inch seam, and I will be back stitching these. And I'll sew all 4 of them together so I have one long strip. Take that long strip that you sewed together, and you're going to fold it in half with the wrong side on the inside and press it. And when you get to your seams, to press them like I sewed them first. On this, mostly in quilting, I press seams to one side. On the binding, I like to press them open because it's less bulky when you're wrapping this around the edge of the quilt. And carry on pressing the seams open and folding it in half and pressing it. For the binding, I usually like to start on the bottom of the quilt, which this is the bottom edge right here. And I'm going to work from the back side first and then to the front. Now, don't ever start right at the corner, because when you're done this, you want to try and get as nice a square corner as possible. And if you start at the corner, that's almost impossible. So I'm going to start a few inches away from the corner, but not right in the center and not right at the corner. So I've got my binding strip here, and it's folded in half, wrong side on the inside. I'm going to unfold it just to start, and I'm going to take the top left corner and fold it down so that this top edge lines up with the side of the binding. So it's like this. And what that does is forms a 45-degree angle here. And I'm just finger pressing that angle. And what I'm doing is setting up for finishing the binding after I've come around the quilt and I'm coming back to where I started. So I've got this fold, and then I'm going to fold it in half again on the original pressing line. And again, I'm just finger pressing. There's a few little creases there, but finger pressing will hold it, and they'll all get dealt with as this is sewn on. So you have something that looks like this. So an angle here, an angle here, kind of a little pocket there. And this is how I'm going to start. So this now is going to line up with the side of my quilt. And I'm going to start up at the top corner here, where the gold is, the edge of the gold is. And I'm on a 2.5 stitch length normal stitching here. Oh, one thing I forgot. I don't usually do this with the 1/4 inch foot. I find that I like it just a little bit wider than a 1/4 inch when I do the binding. So I'm switching back to actually the standard foot for my machine. Instead of a 1/4 inch or a 6 millimeter seam, this is going to be closer to 8 millimeters. And I'm going to sew along the edge of the presser foot. And I just find that little bit wider seam. Make sure that I cover up that zigzag stitching that I did earlier, and works well for folding the binding around the edge of the quilt. So again, I'm going to start here. I'm going to back stitch, and then I'm going to sew, and at the corner I will show you what I do to fold around the corner. So you can see I'm coming up to the edge where I need to turn a corner. So I'm actually going to sew until I'm 1/4 inch from the corner, or 6 millimeters from the corner. And I usually just eyeball it, but if you feel a little insecure about eyeballing it, you can always just put a pin and then you want to sew up to that pin. And accuracy is really important here in order to get a really nice corner. And then I'm going to backstitch and cut my threads here. And you can see on the back side here, I'm about 6 millimeters from the corner there. Turn your quilt so that the next edge is down. You take this binding, and right now it's extending past the edge of the quilt. I'm going to fold it up so that I have a 45-degree angle right here. And if I was to extend this upward, it's even with the edge of the quilt. So I'm then going to take this and fold it down so it's even with the edge of the quilt here, and align it on the side here. And then I'm going to start stitching 6 millimeters or 1/4 inch away from the edge right here. Again, if you want to put a pin in there, you can do that. And that's my starting point. If I look at it on the back, it will be like my stitching lines meet. This one will come from this direction. When I sew here, it will continue down here, almost like I turned a square corner, except that it's 2 rows of stitching that aren't actually connected to each other. Edge of the presser foot, right where that pin is. I'm going to backstitch and continue down, and I'm going to do the exact same thing on each of the corners, and then I'll show you what happens when I connect back to where I started. So I'm coming up to where I started here, and I'm just going to put my threads there. And I've got more here than I need. I'm going to trim this so it cuts off right here where this diagonal connects with the seam right here. So I want it right in here. And then you take this end and just tuck it in here, and it should meet right there. And this looks good. If it doesn't, trim it a little bit more. And then I'm just going to sew and overlap. And so that's how it connects in there. To finish off the binding, we're working on the right side of the quilt. And this is where I joined the 2 ends together. So I like to start just a little bit above that. And I don't pin this, but if you wanted to, you could. And I'm folding over. I've switched out to the gold thread, and I have that in both the top and the bobbin. And I'm just folding enough to cover this row of stitching, which is very clear because of the color I used. And I'm going to back stitch here. And I'm sewing very close to the edge of the binding. So I'm going to stop right there. And I fold the binding over so you have a 45-degree angle right here. And then I have this handy gadget called a tailor's awl that I really like to use for this. So it helps me hold things in place because your fingers are almost too big. And then I fold the other side up. And so when you fold it, you should have a nice 45-degree angle here that meets nicely at the corner. And then I use my tailor's awl to hold things in place because I can sew very close to that awl. And I sew until my needle catches on this side of the fold here. And then you can pivot. And carry on. And when you get to where you started, just overlap a little bit and backstitch. And guess what? My bobbin ran out of thread this far from the end. Don't you love it? Because I am almost out of thread, I am using a bobbin thread that is a slightly different color. And I'm hoping nobody will notice, which I don't think they will unless they closely inspect the back. So overlap where my thread ended, do a little back stitch, and let's finish this. And once again, here I am. That's where I started. Overlap a little. And done. Here's the finished quilt. And I'm just going to go in a little closer so you can see some of the details. So we've got the applique dragon in the center sitting on the clouds. And behind is the sky detail with the Asian cloud look. And the borders, and then clouds again on the outside border. And this baby has arrived just a few days ago. This quilt will be going out to the baby and the family in the next day. This is Paula from Sew Spark Studio. I hope you'll join me again for another project.